There we go. I'm really excited to introduce Dolores Chandler, who is giving a talk called Choosing Both and the Limitations of Binary Thinking in Anti-Violence Work. Dolores uses they, them pronouns and is the founder and principal consultant of Build from the Heart, an equity coaching, facilitation, and consulting practice that works with individuals and organizations to put their values into practice with authenticity and integrity. Please welcome Dolores, and yes, so happy to have you here.
Thanks, Scott. And yes, so definitely not Dolores Claiborne. That's, if you're familiar with Stephen King, that's, yeah, it's totally different vibe there than the one I'm rocking. So thanks everybody for tuning in to this Zoom session. This is a little bit different from how I usually show up into the space, which is with a lot more engagement from the audience and or the participants. So I'm in this case going to be doing some talking for probably about 30 minutes with a couple of pauses in between. And after that, you'll absolutely have there will be time for questions or wonderings or any juicy nuggets that you are maybe sitting with. So in my experience as a prevention educator and now an equity coach, consultant, and facilitator, I've learned that the solutions people and organizations are seeking are never as simple as either or. In the field of anti-violence work, this is often expressed in the tension between crisis response and prevention. The two strategies are often pitted against each other, and at times even forced to compete for resources. But we know that response and prevention are not actually separate ventures. They happen in tandem, at times the force of one pushing movement on the other. In this talk, I'll share some of my experiences and learnings about what it means to let go of either or and embrace both and. So let's begin by going back to 7th grade health class. My first full-time gig out of social work school was as a sexual violence prevention educator at a local rape crisis center. So I spent most of my days in middle and high schools going to health classes and talking to students about the difference between flirting and sexual harassment, breaking down gender roles and stereotypes that perpetuate sexual violence, and the pretty straightforward yet often bewildering concept of consent. During this particular week, I was delivering our flirting and sexual harassment curriculum to a group of about 50 7th graders. Every day, the students would file into the school gymnasium where they would first deposit their backpacks on the bleachers and then come sit, crawl, or sprawl onto the sea of blue gym mats laid out on the floor. So it's our 3rd day together, and we're working through an activity called gender boxes. If you're not familiar with this activity, you essentially draw 2 big boxes on flip chart paper or a board and label one box boys and men and the other girls and women. And you list all of the societal norms, expectations, and stereotypes that are relevant to each. For example, boys like the color blue, and they don't cry or get otherwise emotional except to get angry. Girls, on the other hand, are highly emotional. Boys are tough and strong. They get dirty, they play sports, and they're into cars and stuff. Girls are delicate flowers who must always be concerned with their appearance and engage in activities like cooking, knitting, and gossiping. When it comes to flirting and dating, boys always make the first move, and they always pay for dinner. Girls never make the first move because that would make you a slut, and they never, ever pay for dinner. So you get the idea. As we're making our lists, We're also discussing how adhering to rigid gender roles and stereotypes can perpetuate sexual harassment and other types of gender-based violence. So we ask what happens to people when they test the boundaries of these boxes, or if they don't fit into either one of them at all. At one point, I have the following exchange with the class. I say, there's a stereotype out there that boys are stronger, tougher, and faster than girls. But how many of you know a girl or a woman who's just as tough, strong, and fast as any boy or man you know? Of course, a ton of hands shoot up into the air, and when I ask for examples, they're quick to reply. Some naming friends or family members, and others calling out names of professional athletes. One student doesn't want me to forget about hunting. Girls can hunt too, and as a matter of fact, she's already better at it than either one of her brothers. Okay, so you know that this stereotype isn't true. And yet what happens, for example, when a boy at school isn't particularly tough or fast, or if they can't throw a football, for example? You throw like a girl, yells one of the kids, and a number of them start to giggle. Well, that's interesting, I say. So you insult that boy by telling him he throws like a girl. I wonder, where do you hear that stuff? I ask. A few students say, well, at recess, on the playground, hanging out with friends. And then one boy says, I heard my coach say it yesterday at practice. See, we live in a culture that loves to impose binaries and to pit them against each other. Feminine versus masculine, racist versus anti-racist, good versus bad, response versus prevention, and individual versus systemic. At best, these binaries overly simplify worldviews and experiences that are inherently complex. At worst, these binaries have been used as tools of violence to facilitate schoolyard bullies, locker room talk, and even genocide. Binary thinking is so pervasive that it seeps into even the most mundane interactions and conversations. In fact, let's go back to 7th grade health class, because I know you want to, and I'll tell you how a particular binary was reinforced in one sentence. So overall, it's a fun class. Most of the students are engaged and they're taking my questions seriously. And so I end the lesson with a few minutes to spare, so the students have time to collect their backpacks before the bell rings. The teacher, I'll call her Coach P, from her rolling chair behind the table serving as their desk for the week, bellows, girls, you're dismissed. She gives them a moment before then following up with, boys, you're dismissed. And I need a few of you to help Coach B put the mats away. Well, damn, I think to myself as I stare in disbelief at Coach P for a moment as everyone scrambles toward the gymnasium doors. Allow me now to break down all of the ways that binary thinking around gender manifested throughout this experience. Example 1. The purpose of this activity was to engage students in thinking critically about gender, its construction as a binary, and the potentially devastating impact of rigid adherence to that binary. This binary thinking around gender is, for example, one of the reasons it's so hard for LGBTQ plus survivors of intimate partner violence to access services. For instance, there's a stereotype out there that two women cannot be engaged in an abusive relationship. And on the rare occasion when this does seem to be the case, that the harm doer must certainly be the man or more masculine one in the relationship. Example 2. In one sentence, the other adults in the space undermined all of the work we've done by perpetuating some of the very stereotypes the students and I spent the class addressing. Namely, that if you need someone to help move, carry, or lift something, you get a boy or a man to do it. Perhaps it doesn't seem like a big deal in the moment, but it's a short and slippery slope from boys are tough and strong, and they're built to move, lift, carry things, and otherwise engage in manual labor, to dismissing behaviors like catcalling, not taking no for an answer, and homophobic bullying by affirming that boys will be boys. Now, even though this school district allowed me to come in and deliver this content to their students, the choice that the adults made in that moment, whether it was unconscious or not, sent a message that there's not really any school or system-wide buy-in to the idea that the environment around these students has to support the changes in behavior that we're asking them to make. Ultimately, working with individuals to increase knowledge, change attitudes and behaviors can only go so far if the environment is not set up to support these changes. Example 3. This one's about personal impact. So the act of dismissing the class by sex was an instant invalidation of me and my own existence. At the time, I was newly on testosterone, so my voice was not what it is now. I didn't have the facial hair that I have now, and I definitely had more hair. I had numerous exchanges with students at schools I visited about whether I was a girl or a boy, and was situated firmly in the kind of ambiguous expression of gender that seems to be so anxiety-inducing for cisgender adults. So there I was, talking about the harm that can come to those who don't fit into either one of those boxes. And it's very clear that I do not fit into either one of those boxes. When I heard Coach P dismiss the class, I couldn't help but imagine a young human sitting on those blue mats who maybe didn't fit into those boxes either, filled with anxiety and uncertainty, caught between the truth of who they know themselves to be and a world that will not allow it. It reminds me of this quote that I love by poet Adrienne Rich. She says, when someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you are not in it, there's a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked in the mirror and saw nothing. Often, this is what it feels like to be trans and non-binary and to be consistently invalidated by a system that doesn't see you. The last thing I want to point out in this story is the irony of an act of harm caused during an attempt at prevention. Yes, perpetuating gender stereotypes and demanding compliance with rigid gender roles is an act of harm and a type of violence that contributes directly to the continued oppression overall of women, girls, queer, trans, and gender nonconforming folks, and in particular, those who are also Black, Indigenous, and non-Black people of color. Now, as I broke down each element of this experience, perhaps you were reminded of similar experiences of your own. I'm actually going to give you a moment to recall any experience you might have had of finding yourself trapped within a binary, either personally or systemically. Maybe you've denied yourself the opportunity to express some vital part of who you are because people who look like you don't do those things. Or maybe you've alienated, ignored, punished, or dismissed someone else because they didn't follow the rules that people who look like them ought to follow. So take a minute now to breathe and think, and maybe jot down a few notes about it because we'll circle back around to it. And I'm going to take a sip of water. If you can't think of anything at the moment, that's totally okay. Like I said, we're going to come back to this. For now, let's shift our gaze toward an examination of individual change versus systemic change as yet another binary. So in 2017, I left my job as a prevention educator and turned my 10-year-old side gig into a full-time consulting business built from the heart. I'm happy to say that 100% of my inquiries come from organizations that genuinely want to do better. They want to become more diverse, both racially and with regard to sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. I'll add to this that about 95% of those inquiries also come from predominantly white-led organizations. And given that fact, there's one question that I always ask when interviewing potential clients who specifically want to focus on racial equity. To what extent have you and your team talked about race or racism and its impact on your lives? I'm actually going to copy and paste that question into the chat box because we're going to stay with it for a little while. So let me give you an example to illustrate why this question is important. As I'm sure you're aware, as a consequence of the racial violence committed by individuals and by law enforcement in the summer of 2020, many organizations came out and made explicit statements against that racialized violence and against those killings of Black and Brown people by law enforcement. There's also been a surge of resources allocated by funders to organizations for capacity building around equity and inclusion. This prospective client was one such grant recipient. So the organization reached out because they wanted essentially two things. First, they wanted to become better equipped to mitigate the negative impacts of racism on the children and families that they served. They also wanted to better support the current Black and POC staff, few though they were, and of course, increase the staff's diversity overall. On their website, they published an eloquent and heartfelt statement on Black Lives Matter. And so it was clear to me that from an intellectual perspective, there was an understanding of how race and racism impacts Black and Brown people. In our initial conversation, I asked what sort of work had they done as an organization around racial equity? And they were really honest about the fact that they hadn't done all that much. A few months prior, the entire staff participated in a racial equity training, and the results were somewhat mixed. There was a general sense of gratitude and appreciation for the learning, coupled with a sobering realization that among staff, there existed a wide range of knowledge and understanding about racism, as well as commitment to prioritizing that work within the organization. When I asked the client, to what extent have y'all had conversations about racism and its impact on your lives? I was essentially met with silence. So here's the thing. People, white people in particular, find it so much easier to speak about race from an intellectual perspective than a personal one. It's so much harder to speak about your personal stake or relationship to structural and institutional racism. White people also tend to have an easier time attending trainings and taking classes because it creates a safe distance from which to analyze racism as an external problem to solve, and not one that has anything to do with oneself. After all, everybody knows that racism exists and that it's a problem, but when you look around the room, there's nary a racist to be found. And that's not surprising when our own understanding of what it is to be racist is binary. Racists are people like the Klan. They're bad, hateful people. If you're not a card-carrying member of the Klan, or if you don't love Donald Trump, then you can't possibly be racist. You're a good person. The truth of the matter is that you can be aware of race as a problem, acknowledge it as such, even go to a training or two and still be racist. It's as simple as hearing a Black person or a person of color share a racist encounter they had with another white person and think to yourself, but Rebecca's so nice. I can't imagine her doing something like that. Rebecca's a good person. So here we are, trapped in this binary of racist versus anti-racist, which inevitably leads us to the binary of good versus bad. The good-bad binary is particularly problematic in that when we label something or someone as categorically good or bad, it leaves no room for mistakes, for the possibility of learning and redemption, or for transformation. We're so afraid that we're doing something wrong or of making a mistake because we might get called out or, dare I say it, canceled. But let me put it to you this way. We're talking about addressing and healing from 400 plus years of society built on the subjugation of Black people and the attempted destruction of Indigenous people for the benefit of white people and whiteness. What the hell makes us think that we're going to be able to confront it without making mistakes or without causing harm at some point? This is a problem that impacts everyone, including white people. And the work of dismantling these systems of oppression requires nothing less than complete transformation on a personal and systemic level. All right, y'all, take a deep breath. So we're gonna back out of the rabbit hole a little bit and return to this question that I like to ask my clients. Have you and your team had conversations with each other about racism and its impact on your lives? The question is crucial because it gives me, as a consultant, the important information that I need about where the organization and the individuals within it are at in their journey. Yes, training may be a useful component of capacity building toward equity and inclusion, but training alone will not get us there. Honey, if that were the case, we'd have been free a long time ago. For that, we need a willingness to identify and investigate the racism, ableism, or sexism, the homophobia or transphobia within ourselves. We need to ask ourselves, how have these binaries shaped me and the way I view and move through the world? In the case of racial equity, when an organization asks for training and the white folks on staff see no need or unwilling to engage in deep personal inquiry, it can cause serious harm and re-traumatize those on the team who are systematically and historically oppressed. So I've given you all of these examples about the limitations of binaries and how they trap us in an either-or framework. Ultimately, this framework doesn't allow space or time for the possibility of transformation to emerge. But what does it take for an organization to loosen its grip on either or and make a shift toward embracing both and? From my experience, I can share a few things about this. Number one, be honest about where you are. Number two, you do not have to go it alone. And number three, release yourself from the myth of perfection. So be honest. Be honest about where you are because it's the best way to figure out where to start. Here's the thing. When you're talking about addressing the consequences of over 400 years of racialized trauma, violence, and oppression, there are actually so many points of entry to choose from, and certainly no one-size-fits-all solution. For example, if you've not ever had conversations about race, then perhaps a good place to start is to ask yourselves what you know and what you need to learn more about. Take some time to assess your starting point, and you'll quickly learn, like the client I mentioned, that not everyone is starting at the same level of awareness or understanding or commitment. A common anxiety I hear expressed by organizational leadership is, how do we manage people being at different places in the journey? this is actually a great opportunity to embrace both and. How can we reframe that question into one that acknowledges the complexity of the problem? How can you acknowledge that individuals are at different starting places while communicating clear expectations for professional development and growth around equity? This is a place where individual change and systemic change must work in tandem with one another. One suggestion I almost always make to clients is to incorporate equity goals into annual performance reviews or assessments. Of course, this is only helpful if your organization actually has a practice around annual performance reviews. So on a systemic level, integrating equity goals and criteria into annual reviews creates an opportunity to build shared meaning and understanding between the organization and the individual. It also allows the individual to demonstrate their willingness to learn and to grow, and to undertake the personal investigation required. The system itself will not survive any kind of change if the individuals within it are not also changing. Now, part of acknowledging the fact that everyone is at a different starting place means accepting that some of your colleagues will not come with you. Yes, the organization can create the space for people to learn and grow, but it can't force them. Ultimately, that comes down to willingness and personal accountability. If people are not willing to make the personal transformation to meet the systemic change, eventually they'll go elsewhere, and that has to be okay. You have to be willing to be transformed by the work. And if you're not willing, then at some point you'll become a hindrance and the change will only go so far. So you don't have to go it alone. As individuals, we know that change never happens in a vacuum, and we need others to support us, appreciate us, point out when we're missing something, and to hold us accountable. And the same goes for organizational change. There are so many organizations that are trying to do the work of dismantling repression. Talk to each other about the challenges you're facing or the changes that you're trying to implement, because you might encounter ideas or solutions that you hadn't thought of. I once worked with a client who was trying to rewrite their organization's paid time off policy to be more inclusive. I referred them to another organization that had recently undertaken the same task. That organization's HR person said, "Here, you can have a copy of our employee handbook. We have worked really hard on these policies and we feel pretty good about them. Take what you need and let us know what you think." My client came back to me a couple of weeks later and said, "You know what, this is awesome. It's a great policy. We're totally going to implement it. And I didn't have to reinvent the wheel." My point here is that your agency is not alone, and that embracing both and encourages exploration, experimentation, and collaboration. And finally, please release yourself from the myth of perfectionism. I'll say it again. This is a 400-year-old problem that will require generations of work to heal, and has already taken generations to begin the healing. We can't get it all right. Perfectionism is an ugly-ass beast that lies to us every day. It makes us feel like we have to know everything, and if we don't, then we better not admit it, especially if we're the boss. Perfectionism breeds defensiveness and shame, and when we function out of defensiveness or shame, we cannot listen, we cannot learn, and we cannot grow. In fact, I invite you to go ahead and put a sticky note on your computer, your mirror or wall, or wallpaper on your phone or your gadget or whatever, and in big bold letters, write, "Mistakes will be made. I love you anyway." Expect mistakes because they will happen. And when they do, be willing to look at them and to ask questions. Striving for success and for excellence is great. And we have so much to learn from our mistakes. So speaking of learning and growing, earlier I asked you to think of a time when you found yourself trapped between one binary and another. And now I want you to take a moment to think about the following questions. Write them down if you want to, so you can return to them later. I'll also post them in the chat for y'all. So ask yourself, what do I know now that I didn't know then? If I had it to do again, what would I do differently? What do I wish the people around me had said or done? And let me paste this in the chat as well for you all. Now I'm going to pause for a minute and just let y'all to think on that.
Also, if people do want to speak their answers, and from the attendees, I can give you the mic to be able to speak. So you can raise your hand when it comes to it, if Dolores if that's where you're headed.
Thanks for asking, Scott. So I think that will actually, it would be great if I can finish up and then I can come back and we can see if anybody wants to speak on that.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's all good. Okay, so again, if you couldn't think of anything in the moment, that's okay. You can come back to it. I'm also gonna, take us back to that 7th grade health class one more time to potentially answer some of these questions for this experience. So let's go back. We're back into the 7th grade health class, if only to envision how it could have been different. So let's start with the lowest bar, the coach dismissing the students by sex. Now, I understand that managing a horde of 12 to 13-year-olds is a challenge, and you got to get it done in some way. And there are a million ways to do that don't involve sex or gender. How about if your birthday is before June 1st, you're dismissed. Or if you're wearing the color green, you're dismissed. Or if you lost a tooth in the past 6 months, you're dismissed. And how about simply asking for any student at all who's willing to help with moving gym mats instead of just the boys? So now humor me as I get a little wild with the visioning. Now, what if teachers and administrators were also invited into a conversation about gender roles and stereotypes and asked to reflect on how those binaries showed up in their own work environments? How do they notice these stereotypes playing out among their colleagues? And how can teachers and administrators together work to create an environment where sexual and gender-based violence is not allowed to thrive? It's a big ask, I know. But the beauty of breaking free of binaries is that it makes it possible for us to slow down and to think more creatively, imaginatively, and expansively about how we approach the world and its problems. So I want to close now by saying just a little bit more about what I think both and means. So I was first introduced to this framework when I participated in a racial equity training myself, led by a now defunct group called Dismantling Racism Works. So on day one, the trainer says to us participants that the work of dismantling racism can be so frustrating because it's always urgent, and yet there's no quick fix. I find solace actually in this sentiment because it invites us to pause and to reach for something beyond these binaries that can so limit our experience of the world around us. The work is urgent and there is no quick fix. Both of these things are true. It is urgent because people every day are dying, and there is no quick fix. How can there be for a 400-year-old festering wound? The tension between the two can be unbearable if we feel pressured to choose between one truth and the other. But what if we don't have to choose? What if we let these two truths coexist and explore what might be found in that space in between? It's possible, I think, that we could find some space to breathe and to heal if we sit in that space in between these two truths and in that tension, that we could maybe face our mistakes with compassion and accountability, and to truly see each other as human beings worthy of dignity, respect, and justice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dolores. So if we want to open it for Q&A or conversation, there's a few ways to do it. You could post something in the chat. You can raise your hand and I can unmute you or give you ability to talk, or you could put things in the Q&A for us to look at. Sometimes it takes a little bit for things to start popping up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll also say that if the thinking about a specific situation or experience of getting trapped in a binary sparks something for you or is making you think about something, you don't have to actually like share the hard thing that happened. That you can also share like, oh, it has me thinking about this, or I'm wondering about that.
I have a question if I could start it off, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, so a lot of the talks in this symposium have been, talking about kind of the abolition perspective. And so something I personally grapple with, like working with institutions and nonprofits and stuff like that, is like wanting to end all of these systems, and also trying to access resources within them to help people survive and care for each other. And so that's a different kind of binary, I guess. And I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about maybe like that, the difference between, like how we do abolitionism as a daily practice within all of these, while operating within these systems that are also creating harm. Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yeah. So the example that it it calls to mind for me, Scott, is so pretty recently I was working with a group of folks who were we were talking through cultures of or characteristics of white supremacy culture in organizations. So if you're not familiar, there's a document written by Tema Okun. It's called Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture. And the premise behind that document is to say, like, look, everywhere we go, like there is culture. There's culture in our homes. There's culture in our, like, the places that we live and in our workplaces. And oftentimes these workplace cultures are things that are not explicitly talked about or agreed upon or interrogated. And when one group or identity sort of is the dominant sort of like, you know, able to like dictate what the culture of a place is, then one of the ways that it can continue doing so without ever being challenged is by not making things explicit. So, you know, we are going through all of these characteristics, these tendencies, things like thinking in either or terms, or things like perfectionism or individualism. And woman in the group said to me, you know, when I look at this list and when we're having this conversation, really what you're saying is that like we're all, as institutions, like we're all drinking this water. We were built in this environment, right? There's not a single organization or institution in our country that was not built like after the institution of slavery, right? So that's the truth, right? And so how can we do this work of dismantling racism in our organizations if it's just in the DNA, which is a big question, because to your point, it's sort of like, well, we just have to like take it all apart. And, you know, I don't necessarily like have the like specific answer there, but what I said in the moment was, you know, it's a yes and, right? Like, yes, our organizations are founded upon structural and institutional racism, and that doesn't mean that as individuals within these organizations or as colleagues or as people who work together, it doesn't mean that we can't start making different choices or making different decisions about how we relate to each other as human beings. And that if we start to make different choices around how we relate to each other, that might actually put us on a path toward abolition at some point in the future that we might not even be able to envision right now. And that we do always have the option to say, hey, we're gonna do something different and see where it takes us. I know that my response to your question was kind of rambly. Okay, I see a question in the Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to read this question. So it says, I work in a college, and something I often see is that there are many offices responsible for providing different types of care to students and employees experiencing discrimination on campus. One way I see binarist thinking is the idea of something being considered in or out of an office's purview. Is it HR? Is it Title IX, disability services? What advice do you have for navigating silos we often see within larger organizations, or for framing this siloing as a problem to a campus community? This is such a good question. And I think that so this tendency, right, within organizations to sort of silo sort of jurisdictions or expertise to one department or another, kind of makes the assumption that people are not, well, so it creates an environment where people are not encouraged to seek solutions outside of their like role. And when we sort of assume that everyone must constantly stay in their role and that they might not, and that they don't or shouldn't provide a different perspective, then at the end of the day, what you're missing out on is a solution to a problem that is more nourishing or more rich than the solutions that we come up with when we're caught in this place of like fighting or battling for like who has control or whose responsibility is it to deal with a certain situation. So I think one way that this could actually that you might think about sort of pushing back against this tendency is trying to figure out if there's any opportunity for actually meeting as a collective and sharing, right, about your experiences or the issues that you're facing, right? So like, what are, if you're in HR, like what are the questions that you're trying to answer? What are the things that are challenging? What are the issues that you're trying to deal with? And if you're in Title IX, like what are these questions that you're asking and that you're thinking about? And that if people can come to the table from the perspective of sharing about what they know and being curious about how other people are approaching these problems, then it might actually create the potential for these groups to come to a solution together. And, you know, and it can be just as, it doesn't even have to be like a super formal, you know, thing. Like, what does it look like for, you know, once a quarter or something for these different departments to get together and talk about the issues that they're facing or the gaps that are surfacing, right? And like what might need to happen to ensure that people don't fall through one of these gaps in between departments or offices. You're still welcome, Taylor. And I think what I will also add to that in a broader sense is that, you know, when you're doing something like anti-violence work, and especially if you all are, you know, folks who work in specifically in crisis response, that it can be really hard to sort of like make the time and the space to be relational with folks. And so I think that overall, if there's some way, right, that like as an organization or as an office or as a group, you can sort of include like building relationship as like a part of the job description, and to value it as such, right? So like making the time for it, and again, like starting small with something like that, right? And seeing just what happens and what grows out of it, that little bit of time that you spend building a relationship, being curious about what other organizations and what other folks are doing, really can have the potential for some expansiveness, and at the very least, like less isolation and alienation.
Taylor wrote in the chat, absolutely, I love the idea of including in the description of the job and moving away from, is this my job or not, toward how can I help and what resources can I provide to this situation?
Yes, I think that's a perfect place to start, right?
I can always keep asking questions, but I want to make sure people have space to oh, there's one in the Q&A.
Oh, I see.
I can read it if you like, or do you?
Go ahead.
So MPCC Interviews is asking, thinking about your experience and insight about pushing people to think about their personal interactions with systems of oppression, for example, racism, has made me wonder if you see a similar disconnection among LGBTQ plus and gender variant communities around the harm of internalizing the binary.
I mean, the short answer is yes, and let me think about it for a minute. Yeah, I think that one place in particular where I do see sort of that similar disconnect showing up is when people, for example, there's this tension, right, between people who identify as cisgender and as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, right, and the people who identify as like genderqueer or non-binary, that there's a tension there because, and I think that tension is a classic example of internalizing a binary way of thinking about gender. And so, I mean, I remember from my personal experience, just even as a young queer person who was attracted to femme women and feminine and femme presenting women, and I, as a masculine identified person, like what models or examples did I have in the world of what it meant to embody masculinity in a way that wasn't harmful or violent or oppressive, right? And so in one sense, someone can identify as trans and transition from one end of a binary way of being directly into another. And if there's no investigation of that, then I do think that it can come with internalizing like the harmful aspects, right, of like gender stereotypes and gender roles. So I think that there have been times when I've been around a room full of cisgender gay and lesbian folks and have been alienated and dismissed because of the fluidity of my gender expression, right? Or there's perhaps this assumption that that we have to be one or the other, and that if we don't fall into either one of those categories, and that makes it harder for people who are gay and lesbian or bisexual to like be taken seriously in the world. And I'll also say that I think that there's a generational disconnect. you know, the more that like LGBTQ plus folks and like non-binary folks, the more visible that we become, like the more language we will start to hear and to use to describe ourselves. And so sometimes there's a generational disconnect, right, between how one person who you know, like I, for example, who will freely use the word queer or gender nonconforming or non-binary versus a, you know, person in their 50s or 60s who really struggles with that type of with that language, because it feels either like there's a negative connotation or that it somehow invisibilizes some part of their identity, right? And so again, I'll say that one way to bridge that gap, or to try to bridge that gap, is to ask, like, how is gender, like, and our expectations and our assumptions about gender, like, how are they at work here, right? Like, what is your understanding of gender, and how has it impacted you in the world? And what is my understanding of gender, and how has it impacted me in the world, right? Even if our language or our identities are different, that the forces of like binary identities still operate in our lives. And I see someone in the chat that says, Nika Onwara's The Same Difference explores this too in the context of what it means to be a Black masculine presenting lesbian. Nice. Also, thanks for dropping a resource in the chat.
I'll jump in. What do you think the relationship, like, how do you view the relationship between, say, like, you know, grassroots work, community work, you know, nonprofit and different kind of institutional organizational work towards like systemic and personal change? Like, how do you think those things can work together, or how do they interfere with each other?
That's a good question. So I think that sometimes because of an institution's sort of like visibility or access to resources, that they can often be the first point of contact for someone who is a survivor in terms of accessing any type of service, whether it's a crisis service or accountability service, or healing, you know, whether it's like clinical therapy or in the moment, like I said, crisis intervention. And so I think that there is an extent to which institutions are well equipped to function within the system as it is, right? And so on the other hand, we know that there are things that institutions like are not equipped to do or can't because of funding limitations, put certain resources in a particular place, right? And so again, I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing for the relationship to be, you know, um, tense, or for there to be some friction there, because I think grassroots groups and organizers and activists, they're about the work of pushing for change that does need to happen, and I think that pushing is a good thing. And I also think that institutions or agencies that we find ourselves employed in or interacting with um, have the potential to take what is happening, to either be a conduit for people who are trying to access services to community healing opportunities when they're not able to like provide that resource. And I think that institutions can also hold even larger institutions, right, accountable for making sure that the communities that you serve are adequately resourced. And so again, it's a both and, right? The institutions are here, and so what does it mean for these institutions to still be here and to be relating to community groups or activists as potential resources for the community that they're trying to serve. So Ashley's asking in the chat, I'm loving this conversation. Thank you. From your insight in working with students around this subject, what do you think is most important for educators to implement in the minds of young people when it comes to gender and sexuality? How do you think we should best support the self-discovery, questioning that adolescents often face, especially when the world can often be less accepting? Thank you for the question. So I think that it's, it's I'm laughing now because I'm thinking of my partner who's a teacher, and she like loves to do this thing where she'll like ask me a question and I'll answer it, and then I'll be like, well, what about you? And she's like, well, I don't know, I didn't think about it, right? And so I guess that's my funny way of saying like, be willing to answer yourself the questions that you pose to adolescents, right? When because they have the potential to be points of connection with adolescents, right? And to sometimes I think as teachers, there's a lot of pressure to like not be human when it comes to your students, like particularly around issues of sexual and gender identity. And so to be able to have a conversation with an adolescent, right? That's more of like, when I was 16 years old, this is what I thought about gender. And like, this is how I realized that that's impacting me. And like, is that how it's showing up for you? Like, how is it showing up for you? Like, I don't know. And I'm curious. Right. So I think that our willingness, right, as teachers and adults to be a little bit more human, insofar as we can, is, I mean, not to be dramatic, but could potentially be life-saving to a young person who's thinking about their own gender or their own sexuality. Um, and so you know, I think the best thing that we can do is support young people in building the confidence in themselves to be okay with the decisions that they make, right? And I think, one of the other ways that binary thinking sort of shows up um, in people's gender journeys is that, we think that because someone one day, spends like half the year wearing dresses to school and wanting to like be on the girls team, that puts them in that gendered category for the rest of their life, and that there's actually pressure, right, that if you say you are this thing, then you have to be that thing, right? And there's no opportunity for expansion or for experimentation, for the pursuit of really truly understanding who we are in the world, right? So I think being willing to say to folks like, what you're working through right now is like what you're working through right now. And if that changes over the course of the years, that's absolutely okay, right? That it's okay to change. It's okay to have different expressions of gender throughout the course of your life, right? That it's not an end all be all, or an either or situation. So again, potentially rambling answer to your questions.
We have a few more minutes for further questions before the session ends. So if anyone wants to type in a Q&A or chat. Also, if you'd rather speak your question, you can raise your hand and I can let you talk in the attendee. The webinar structure doesn't allow it. It makes it a little bit harder to get to that. So just raise your hand. The raise hand button's on the bottom. By the way, just to make sure it's clear, I don't mean raise your physical hand.
I'm actually having there's one more thing I want to add to the to Ashley's question about sort of, supporting self-discovery when the world can be less accepting. So I actually, the little example I gave about a kid, wearing dresses to school, comes from this interaction that I had where the kid who still uses he him pronouns, but very much like identifies as a girl and is moving through the world at school in that way, was starting to receive some pushback from other kids at school. And when and so when the father of this child was sort of having a conversation with the kid about this, and kid said that they wanted to actually start maybe wearing pants to school, and to stop wearing dresses, that the father said, if that's what like what you want to do, then I'd support you. Like, just so you know, like, I love, like, I want you to wear and feel like you can wear whatever you want to wear, that feels best to you. And if you decide that it's a little bit easier than that, you want to do a different thing, even for a little bit, then that's okay. Like, I'll support you, like, whatever your decision is. And so I think that that's honestly a really beautiful sentiment. Excuse me now, as my battery is about to die, so I have to do some gymnastics to make sure that doesn't happen. You know, to be willing to create an environment where a young person can explore their gender or their sexuality, and to do it on their own terms, I think is one of the best, if not sometimes, heart-wrenching ways to show support.